Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody could take their seat. Welcome to the 2019 Scudderman Symposium. We are thrilled to have you here. We're excited about our program. My name is Bob Stewart. I'm the director of the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism. And I want to say how grateful we are to Pat and Smitty Scudderman, who are sitting in the front row. They have been generous, loyal alumni, and not only have they given us their resources to make this possible, but they also give us their attention. They come every year, and we are thrilled that they are able to be here because we know how much they enjoy it, and they enjoy seeing us enjoy it. So thank you, Pat and Smitty. We will thank you early and often today and tomorrow. My colleague, Stan Alofs from the School of BizCom, would like to say a couple words too.
Good morning. Again, thank you so much for coming. This is part of what makes the Scripps College and Ohio University unique. We have these opportunities to listen to and interact with some of the leading folks in this industry. And it's inspiring, but also it's part of what makes us a community. And it's a really small world. And so that kind of connection is really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. To get us started, I want to introduce the program generally and then also our specific topic for this next session. This year's Scudderman Symposium theme is The Big Story. So every one of our presentations represents a compelling topic with speakers who can talk about the big stories of our day. Our first program, of course, is no exception. Last year, the Cincinnati Enquirer sent more than 60 reporters, videographers, and photographers into their community to chronicle the destructive power of heroin. The speakers for this program are some of the Bobcats who were on that team, whether they were from the School of Journalism or the School of Visual Communication. Together with their colleagues at the Enquirer, they chronicled an ordinary week in this extraordinary time. Joining us from the Bobcat team at the Enquirer, we have Michael Nyerges, thank you, who graduated from BizCom in 1995 and joined the Enquirer in 2003. His current job title is visual journalist with a primary focus on producing motion graphics and video for Cincinnati.com. We also have Megan Vogel, who almost couldn't be here because she was supposed to be in Nepal, but that fell through, so fortunately we were able to have her here. Also a visual journalist at the Enquirer, her hometown paper. She graduated from BizCom in 2013 and actually remembers attending these symposia as a student. She was the associate producer and visual journalist on the project being featured today. She recently was named one of 30 female emerging photographers under the age of 30 in the world. Well done. Next to her is Ann Sager, who was born and reared in Columbus, Ohio. She used her journalism degree from back in the 80s. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I won't say the exact name. To build a coast-to-coast career as a versatile daily journalist. She spent many years on the West Coast and returned to Ohio in 2012, and we're very glad that she did. Thank you for coming home. Sarah Volpenheim is a watchdog reporter with the Marion, Ohio Star, sitting next to Ann. Before joining the Star in June 2017, she was a reporter at the Grand Forks Herald in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where she covered breaking news and the criminal justice system. She's a 2014 graduate of the Scripps School. And finally, on the end, we have Dan Horn, who was the main writer for this series. Dan covers special projects and features, which means he has written about prison riots, hurricanes and floods, financial meltdowns, serial killers, foster kids, pornographers, politicians, and sometimes that's all the same, and a professional wrestler named Shark Boy. he may elaborate on that, we'll see. This series, called 7 Days of Heroin, won the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. The Pulitzer judges said that 7 Days of Heroin was, quote, a riveting and insightful narrative and video documenting 7 days of Greater Cincinnati's heroin epidemic, revealing how the deadly addiction has ravaged families and communities. Before turning the mic over to Dan and his colleagues, I would simply like to point out the obvious. This symposium is a collaboration between the schools of journalism and visual communication. The fact that our speakers represent both schools should suggest to everyone in this room that it is good and even urgent to work together across these two schools while you're still enrolled here. The truth is, you will need to work together when you graduate, so why not get a jump start? And I also just will say a footnote, this symposium over the last decade, a little more than a decade, has really helped the two schools' faculties work together more. And we are neighbors now in Schoonover Center, so that also helps. But this symposium series has sort of laid the groundwork for that. So I'd like to say a special thank you for that. And I think we have some working proof up here of the importance of that. So welcome to the Enquirer Bobcats.
Thank you guys for being here. Can everybody hear me okay? We really appreciate you guys being here. This project means a lot to us for a lot of the reasons Bob just said. You know, we worked together on it for a long time. We worked as a team, and you know, that kind of work matters a lot more in a lot of ways, especially today, than individual work does. So we appreciate you coming out to hear about how we did it and why we did it. I hope if there's one takeaway from this morning, I think I can speak for everybody here, it's that you know, local reporting still matters, it's still relevant, despite layoffs and buyouts and more recently attacks on our credibility by people who maybe would prefer we weren't doing the work that we do. It still matters, and we can still have a big impact on our communities if we do that kind of work. Everybody in our newsroom was a part of this project. Everybody embraced it, from Peter Bhatia, our top editor, to the half-dozen interns who happened to be working in our newsroom that summer. It was embraced by everyone, I think, for the reasons that our project editor, Amy Wilson, said after we were done with this. She said, you know, I think we did this for the right reasons. And I think she got that right. You know, we saw a problem in our community that wasn't getting the attention it deserved. And everyone in the room knew it. And everybody in the room committed to doing this. And you know, when you pull together like that and you accomplish something like that, it matters a lot more than the kind of work that any of us do, I think, on our own. So I think we're going to show you a little promo. This is not to be confused with the mini documentary that Meg and Carrie Cochran did. That was a companion piece to the main story, but it'll give you a little bit of an idea of why we did this and how we did it.
Babies will be born to heroin-addicted mothers. Courts will take children from addicted parents. Taxpayers will spend heavily to lock up drug users. People will overdose in gas stations and parks and school parking lots.
So that voice you heard there was Terry DeMio. She, in addition to being a great reporter and a great human being, is also kind of the patron saint of this project. She is our heroin reporter, and she's the first reporter in this country to actually have that designation as a dedicated reporter to covering the heroin epidemic. She had been doing it about a year or so before we started this project. And at some point before that, we'd had some conversations about a problem that she had. And the big problem was that while the work she was doing was great work, and it was getting a lot of attention from this core group of people, public health officials, law enforcement, families with a stake in this thing because they had relatives who were suffering from addiction, it was not breaking through beyond that to the broader community. And after a while, as with any big story, people hear it over and over again. They hear about heroin over and over again, and they get a little desensitized to it. It just kind of becomes background noise, maybe like the Mueller report. You know, you just hear it all the time, and you start to glaze over when you see it. And I think Terry sensed that that was happening, so we had some conversations about stories that we could do to try to break through that. And one of those ideas that came out of that conversation was taking a day-in-the-life approach to showing this epidemic, because people were literally walking past it, literally in the parks, courts, on the street on the way to work, in parking lots when they were going to the drive-thru at McDonald's, and they weren't seeing it anymore. Maybe at one point they were paying attention, but it seems that it just faded away. So this idea to do a day in the life of heroin came around, and we decided pretty early on that a day in the life wouldn't be long enough. We'd have to have a couple days, and then that became a week. And so we talked about this, and we decided we could do this, but we have to have the entire staff to do this. There's no way that she or I or a handful of reporters and photographers could possibly do that story. So we did what you do when you have a big story like that. We put it on our to-do list, and we went on and did other things. And there it sat for probably about 2 years, and it became almost a running joke for my immediate supervising editor. Every week we'd sit down to talk about what I'm working on, what I want to work on, and he'd look at my to-do list and he'd just, how's that heroin story going? And I'd say, it's going great, you know. And so we'd wait. I said, I'm still waiting. So finally, Peter Boccia found out about this story, and he said, let's do that. And so we freaked out because they said yes. But Peter likes to say, all I did was say yes to this. But the reality is saying yes to a project that involves the entire newsroom, literally the entire newsroom, for a week is a huge commitment, because newspaper editors have to think about things other than just one project. They got to figure out how they're going to put a paper out every day. So after we freaked out, we started planning. We had meetings with everyone who was going to be involved in this thing. We started talking about how we might approach this and what we wanted to do with it. We knew we had to get it right, because as good a guy as Peter is, we knew he wasn't going to give us another week if we screwed up this week. So we had to pick the right week, we had to plan it aggressively, and we had to make it work. So we had a series of meetings with the staff. We talked about the approach. We knew we wanted to take this narrative, real-time approach. We didn't want to just go out and tell sad stories. We didn't want to just go out and interview people about, gee, isn't the heroin epidemic a terrible thing? We wanted to go out and show people viscerally what this looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. So in these meetings with reporters, we talked about, we don't want you to go out and think about writing a story about how awful heroin is, because you're going to go out and you're going to capture moments in time. You're going to go out on these assignments that we've created, about 25 to 30 a day sometimes. You're going to be present where this epidemic is. You're going to pay attention to it. You're going to document it. You're going to keep track of the time of day that it happened. We want you to pay attention to dialogue. We want you to think cinematically about what this looks like. We don't want you to think about nut graphs, and we don't want you to think about a story, because you're not going to write that story. We're going to have to get those are the raw materials that are going to come back, and then we're going to sit down and piece this thing together. And that's a heavy lift. A lot of reporters, all of us, don't do that every day. I mean, I've been around a while, so I've done a good bit of narrative reporting, but it's not something you do every day, and it's not the way you think normally as a reporter. You go out and you cover the story, and you write your inverted pyramid, and you go on to the next story. So we were asking people to do a lot of things they didn't normally do. And we wanted it to be, and I told them at the outset, you're going to hate us when it's over, because 90+% of this is not going to get in this story, but write everything down, document everything, shoot everything, record everything, and bring it back. Just bring back the raw materials, and when you do that, then we can start figuring out where the scenes are, where they fit, and write an actual story about this thing. And we knew we wanted data to be a part of this. Mike's going to talk about that in a few minutes. We wanted some heft to this. We didn't want it to be, as I said, just some sad stories, because we wanted to be able to say, it's not just these images, it's not just these people. These numbers add up. There's a cost, there's a human cost, there's a financial cost, there's a cost to your community, whether you care about that person or not, whether you know that person or not, there's a cost to you because this is happening. So and I'll let Mike do the detail, but we knew early on we wanted data to be a part of it. We wanted visuals to be a huge component of this. We wanted people to experience it viscerally in that way. Kate, Meg, and Carrie did tremendous work on that, and I'll let her talk about that in a little bit. And we knew we wanted to have everyone out there engaged in this thing, and everyone was. You know, they did their job. They went out and they came back with terrific stuff. And you know, every scene we went to, every day we had a spreadsheet with all the assignments on it, and we all go out and we built in redundancy as much as possible because we knew some of these, maybe a lot of these, weren't going to work out. And everyone went out and spent days. I mean, Meg and I went on an assignment. We spent 14 hours with Amy Parker. And just an example of all, you know, I filled a notebook. Meg burned a couple memory cards probably. And when we got back and started going through the scenes, there was one moment that worked for that scene. And I used probably about 2 minutes of the time I spent with Amy in those 14 hours for that particular scene that I wrote for that particular day. And that was just, and we did the same for everybody. We had literally, when we sat down to start beginning the writing process, there was a stack of papers, all the notes, and we just, because we're old, Terry and I, we started going through it with you know, just printouts and stick-em notes and tagging them, and we created a storyboard. And as we went through these, we started trying to identify the scenes that would work, the scenes that wouldn't, and then started blocking them out on a big storyboard on a wall. And Photo did the same thing. Meg and Carrie did the same thing with the video, the raw video material, and just blocking all that stuff out and figuring out where it works. And then the process of writing begins, and you just start working your way through it. And what we found early on was what we suspected early on, was that by stripping these stories down to their essence, just coming in for a moment, you sweep into their lives and you come back out, that propels the story. We were really worried about this bogging down. It's a big story, and just because it's an important story doesn't mean people are going to read it. We wanted people to read it, so we dropped in a bunch of 911 calls. We dropped in police reports to try to increase the pacing. And every scene is kind of stripped down to just a moment. There's a little bit of background folded in, a little bit about these people's lives, but we're in and out, and that's it. There was one through line, one story that we continued each day. We wanted to try to have one narrative piece that would continue throughout the week. Fortunately, we identified that early on in the week, and were able to carry that through. But other than that, these were moments in time where we were trying to bear witness to the epidemic. And that was the writing process. And you know, the response was great. We'll talk more about this after Meg speaks, but you know, we didn't know how this was going to be received, but you know, we have a system at work that allows you to track people viewing your stories in real time, which is fascinating and horrifying at the same time, because you know exactly who's reading the story or who's not reading the story every time it goes up. Because of some technical issues we had initially, that story didn't drop until a Sunday afternoon, a gorgeous Sunday afternoon, which was 3 days later than we'd hoped. And Terry and I were texting like, nobody's going to read this story, nobody's going to find this story. By that evening, about 2,000 people were reading the story, and about 100 or 200 is typically really good. By the next morning, about 9,000 people were reading it. And I think, unfortunately, the reason that I think it resonated was because so many people are touched by this story. Not our story necessarily, but by the story of heroin and this epidemic. And hopefully, this helped shine a light on that epidemic in our community. So I think we had a lot of folks, boots on the ground, folks who are out there reporting this stuff. They did fantastic work. Like I said, everyone embraced this thing. Everyone really stepped up, and Ann can talk a little bit about that, and then later we can talk a little about some of the ethical things and legal things that we ran into along the way.
It's a Thursday morning, about 9:30. It had been raining for hours. My colleague, Kara Owsley, and I were assigned to the neonatal abstinence clinic at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Terry and Dan had done extraordinary work in laying the groundwork of where they wanted all these reporters to be. I'm the health reporter, so it made sense for me to go to Children's Hospital. Our hope was that we would get into the neonatal abstinence clinic, so we would talk to a mom with her child who would be bringing the baby in for an appointment. This particular clinic had been established to try and keep up with these babies who were born either dependent or addicted to heroin or opioids, because there are tremendous deficits that come to these children under these conditions, chiefly visual disability, oftentimes mental or physical disability. So we walked in and we sat in the waiting room for a while and talked to some of the caregivers, and then Jim Fuhrer, the public affairs officer for Cincinnati Children's Hospital, said, "I've got a mom who wants to talk to you." We thought, great. So he ushered us into an examination room where we met Stephanie Gaffney, who had been addicted for 5 years to heroin and had been 16 months in a sober living facility, completely clean, in which time she delivered Eliana, who on this particular day had just turned 8 months old. Happily, Eliana was in pretty good shape, all things considered. She was in good health, and the caregiver came in and examined her, and we spent about an hour in the room talking to Stephanie, who was forward-looking and happy and had just gotten engaged to the father of Eliana. And she said to us, "My plan is that we're going to get out of sober living, and I'm going to marry Eliana's father, and we're going to have a normal life, or as normal as addicts can have." To this day, that sentence haunts me, because she knew the battle she was up against. This was a wonderful occasion. Kara and I went back to the newsroom thrilled, delighted. I think I babbled to Dan and Terry for an hour about how exciting this was, this moment in the middle of this horrible epidemic where there's nothing but sadness and destruction. Here is this bright light, hope, forward, life. So I thought, this is great. So I wrote up my notes that day while they were still fresh, and I gave them to Dan. I thought, this is going to be great. This is going to be a turning point moment in this story. Exactly 2 weeks later, Jim Fuhrer called me back one morning and said, "Have you looked at your paper today?" And I said, "No, why?" He said, "That mom you interviewed 2 weeks ago, her obit is in your paper today." Spoiler, sorry. And so I immediately went and got a paper, ripped it open, and sure enough, there was her picture and a very short obituary. And Kara came over to my desk. And I am proud to say I've never done this before, but she and I embraced, and we must have sobbed for 5 minutes. Because we had both been talking for 2 weeks about how excited we were to have this wonderful moment in this story. So, of course, Dan and Terry came in, and we sat up and talked about, well, what do we do with this? And through the whole production of this story, in the days and weeks that followed, we kept talking about, what do we do with this? How do we tell this component of the story? Her death had fallen outside the 1 week period we had defined as our story. So, do we keep her in? We debated taking it out entirely, but as Dan kept saying, this is the one happy moment of the story. So we talked a lot about how do we tell this story, but put this extremely important moment in it without breaking the narrative. And what we ultimately decided to do was to tell the story of the moment in the clinic where the baby's being examined and the mom's talking to the caregiver. And then at the end of that segment, we just had literally a parenthetical in italics that said, 10 days later, Stephanie Gaffney died of an overdose. And I don't know about you all, but I cannot tell you how many people have told me that that was the moment in the story that it became clear the devastation that this was causing to people and to families and to our community. I don't know why it was, except I think for most people, the thought of a mother looking at her infant and then making that choice after 16 months of sobriety, for some reason that resonated. A few days after we found out she had died, I went to the funeral, and it was packed because she had this huge family that had been devoted to trying to get her into sobriety. And I introduced myself to her mother and her stepfather, gave out my card, and I said, I'm sorry to do this to you right now. And they were grateful to see us there. They were happy that we were there. They wanted witnesses. And Kara and I decided that after 7 Days of Heroin published, we wanted to see what happened to Eliana, because now she was parentless. And so we took it upon ourselves to follow the case through the court system. And there was some back and forth because her father wanted custody, but he was using. And he had violated probation a couple of times. So life was not stable for him. So her mom and stepfather went to court and won custody of her. And they're in their 50s. They were getting ready for retirement. And imagine having someone hand you an infant. Here you go. But they're delighted. And just last week, Stephanie's mother sent me pictures of Eliana, who's now in her terrible twos and wants to be a ballerina. And so I have pictures of her in a tutu and with her stuffed animals. And she is stunning and happy, looks just like her mom. And this is where this particular story track goes into the future and this has happened over and over and over again. There are parents of adult children who are now rearing the babies. And this is a component of the story that is vitally important for folks to understand. This is a cost to all of us. It's what we all must share. So thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Sarah, who's going to talk a little bit about her component of the story. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sarah Volpenheim. I'm a reporter. Oh, can you guys hear me?
It's working.
Is that, okay. I'm a reporter with the Marion Star, and of the 60 reporters who contributed to this story, about 20 of us are with sister papers to the Cincinnati Enquirer, which are all across Ohio. And the Marion Star is one of them. There's papers in Newark, Chillicothe, Mansfield, about 6 other cities across Ohio. And what was so important to me, what I thought was a big success of this story was the collaboration, because this was a story that we as an individual paper would have had a very hard time telling just on our own. Just to give you kind of a sense of where my paper was at the time when this reporting project was done. I had been on the job at the Marion Star for 4 weeks. I was alone, so there were no other reporters with me. We were working on filling a second reporter spot. The editor who was over me, he was new to Marion as well and had only been working with the Marion Star for about 4 weeks also, about as long as I had been there. So this kind of reporting project would have been so difficult to do for a paper of our size without, this kind of collaboration with the Cincinnati team and with the other reporters across Ohio that are the sister papers. And it's just as important of a story where I report, as it is everywhere in Ohio. It's an epidemic that touches all places in the state. And, we see all of the problems that Cincinnati sees with grandparents raising their grandchildren because their parents are in jail or in prison or trying to recover and unable to take care of their kids. Just to give you kind of an idea of some of the things that we found, something that happened to a lot of us was that we came across ways just kind of fortuitously to cover heroin in our communities. A lot of us, there were things that just kind of popped up during this 1 week span that we had not been anticipating. You know, we'd spent the weeks leading up to this week planning, trying to coordinate with the other newspapers across Ohio to try to get a breadth of places where we could show how the heroin epidemic had touched people, so jails, prisons, children's services, you know, people who are in recovery, courts. So we tried to assign people to different places to try to, you know, make sure we had a breadth of experiences to talk about. But in all of our cases, something popped up that we ended up covering as a part of the project. In one of my colleagues' cases in Mansfield, she was at a village council meeting, and a mother whose daughter had just died a couple months ago from an overdose that happened to involve fentanyl, the very powerful synthetic opioid that has, you know, driven up the number of lives that have been lost to this epidemic. That mother talked for an hour at the village council meeting about the epidemic and what it had done to her family. And one of the things that we were trying to do was really capture the mood also of what was going on. And Emily Mills, our colleague in Mansfield, she you know, was noting this mom had this legal pad stuffed with papers about what she wanted to tell to these council people. And she said that she didn't really need to refer to her notes that much because this mom, you know, was so, she just knew all of this by heart. She'd just been thinking about it so much. Another story, one that I covered for this week was I went into the prisons, and we have 2 prisons in Marion, and there was a Narcotics Anonymous meeting there. And it was very striking that a lot of the inmates had the same worries and anxieties about, you know, what were they going to do when they left prison? How were they going to stay away from heroin or from cocaine or from other drugs that would fuel their addiction? And just kind of all of them repeated, like, oh, what am I going to do? What am I going to do when one of my old friends who is still struggling with addiction comes up to me and wants to party or go out? So capturing those moments was definitely a big part of the story. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mike. Are you next?
I'm next, yeah. Our graphics guru, our data guru at the Enquirer, Mark Wirt, he has this quote up on his desk, and I thought it was perfect for what we're going to talk about. How data's like coal, it's dirty, abundant, and difficult to mine. As Dan mentioned, in the very first meetings we had, we wanted the data, the graphics that accompanied this to be contemporaneous, to show you the running toll, not just be one chart that you saw or, you know, one small graphic. We wanted it to run along because the numbers would help illustrate the problem, you know, the enormity of the problem. But to do that, you can't bake a cake without ingredients, so you've got to find that data. And so that, you know, our team in Cincinnati and the graphics people at USA Today and our page designers in Louisville, we could figure out how to visualize that. So to do that, one of our great reporters, Carrie Blackmore-Smith, was put in charge of trying to find the data. She could probably tell the story better than me, but she went to Bowling Green, so you're stuck with me here. But she started out with herself and a group of interns, and they started calling around. They called all sorts of different agencies. and fire, cops, hospitals, health departments, et cetera. And they had meetings with Dan and the whole team to decide what are the relevant statistics we want to try to find and what's realistic to find. So they went about their business to find everything, and they came up with a list of probably about 20 different things to shoot for. And at the end of the day, they ended up with a list of about 10 solid data points that they felt solid about. Everybody felt solid about we feel good about these numbers, that we can stand by these numbers. And at the end of that, we ended up only focusing on 4. And it was these 4 numbers that we really hammered, especially the deaths and the overdoses. And I think Dan mentioned to me that even that number of overdoses there, that's probably low, but that's just what we could confirm. Yeah, probably about half, yeah, as he says. So that's what I had to say. So we're going to turn it over now to Meg, who's going to talk about the visuals.
Okay, so we have a team of about 7 photographers, and because there were anywhere from like 20 to 30 assignments every day, we could not be everywhere. What we did was everyone has an iPhone, and so we were giving these guides basically to every reporter of how to shoot video, how to take pictures, keeping it very simple, because what we wanted was as much as we could possibly gather. This is crucial for us, and Dan mentioned it as we'll figure it out later, but just bring everything you can back. So there was an extensive editing process on this piece. This is most of our visual staff and honorary Dan going through. We had this room that we hung every picture up that we, after coming back and editing down, and then we went through. These are our scenes from every day that Dan wrote out. And this is after cutting. This is cutting significantly. So every card is a different scene, a different time. And this is something, Carrie Cochran and I produced the video, which we did not anticipate being 30 minutes. We were kind of given the orders of, make it 4 minutes, make it tight, make it quick, chop. But it didn't show the full breadth of what we were seeing. We didn't know what we were gonna get until we had experienced the week. Even after it took a lot of processing and going and finding 911 calls, surveillance footage. We went and found all of this body cam footage, and again, 90% of it didn't even make it in. But we went through, and a lot of these you've seen, because all of this, to reiterate, we have a small team. All of this was in 1 week. We were up at dawn. We were up, past midnight, trying to get everything together, trying to show the time of day was huge. And the passage of time, we didn't do anything else besides this reporting that week. And even looking at it now, it's been 2 years, and it's kind of amazing to me that we were able to be in so many different places. And this is Liz DeFore, who is one of our main photographers, going through. And this is something that I actually learned here, to hang your pictures up and to look at them critically, have a fresh set of eyes on them. And this is something that we did, and it was a huge help in this project. Everything from going to building the online presentation, to building the print, to figuring out social plans, having these pictures up. It also was really inspiring to people in the newsroom to see, because sometimes people would do 1 assignment or 3 assignments, but to see it all together was really important. So video was crucial for this project. What we did was I have like different little segments from the full video that I was just gonna show. Again, we were trying to show time of day. I mean, we made a list of all the things that we'd like people to shoot, and my big thing was like, make sure you get a clock in there. Make sure you get like the sunset and doing this. We had all these time lapses. Again, we did not use a lot of clocks, but we had them. We wanted to make sure we had those. Because we were just casting this such a wide net. So this was like the first day. This is Monday. We are at the Hamilton County Justice Center. I cut the audio so we can just talk. And these are all the people that have been arrested. And this was definitely eye-opening for us. The last woman, she had needles in her vagina. And it was very, these were moments that were very surprising to us. And it was important for us to start here, and we ended the story here as well. The 911 calls was a great transition for us. We listened to hundreds of 911 calls to figure out what were the moments that were, again, in those plain places. Here we are at the Covedale Library. This is, everyone goes there. We have 911 calls from parks, Burger King, homes, and so we were trying to pick those moments because, again, when you're putting this whole narrative together, there's a lot of 911 calls that we had to cut, but we wanted to try and find where we had holes, and this was a big help for us. So I'm going to play this one.
Cincinnati 911, what is the address of your emergency? 4980 Glenlake Avenue, Covedale Library. All right, what's going on here? We have a patron that was reported by other patrons sitting around him, and he had been nodding out at the table, and then he collapsed to the floor and hit his head on a post and maybe a table leg. My children's librarian is asking for Narcan. She thinks that he may be overdosing.
Hello?
Hello, Cincinnati 911.
Yes, please, sir. My brother and his friend overdosed.
Where's
In
he
the
at?
car. I'm going to the restroom corner.
And how many people were overdosed there?
Nathan and he is going in and out. Jim is laying on the ground outside.
Are they breathing?
The left are blue.
Okay, we're sending the paramedics, okay?
So this was a child calling in. We identified these calls, and then we went back and filmed this footage and the juxtaposition of these very dramatic calls, also kind of nonchalant calls, because this is a reality that we see all the time in our community, and we wanted to show that. We are a part of this community, and we wanted to show all of the facets of where this touched, and that was from the overpass, going to the overpasses. People are walking by this every morning going to work. And it was so important for us. I mean, this is 6 a.m. and they're getting arrested and kicked out. And this police officer is the most gentle, making sure that the handcuffs are okay, that she's not hurt. And people are just walking into work. These are just small snippets. I don't want to show the full video, but it was also really important. We were going out constantly trying to find overdoses. I sat at a police station for 8 hours a Saturday night, and I was at a fire station, and I was going with the paramedics, and I was just at the wrong station because we got no calls. I left, and they got 3 calls. That's how it works. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. I think it's done. But all the other stations were getting calls, and it was just we had to be in the right place at the right time. So even during that week, it was very frustrating. It sounds weird to say this is we wanted to be able to capture it because it was happening, but when you weren't there and you're hearing it on the scanner, and this was at noon in a little park in downtown. This man got up and walked away with his friends. It was also really important for us to show not just someone overdosing on the sidewalk. This is Brianna and Jackson. Their mom died the year before of an overdose, and they are living with their grandmother. And so we wanted these moments of them just being kids and just being, living their lives. And so we were trying to have that variety, because again, it can't just be people dying on a sidewalk, because that's not just what this epidemic is. It is grandparents raising their children and also having baths and having story time. And then the end of the piece, we go back to the Hamilton County Justice Center. And that is where we meet Dan. I was not here. My colleague Sam Green was filming this this was right, I think it was about 10 o'clock. There is a clock in this one, you'll see. But I edited this footage. I spent hours with Dan, and it was incredibly hard for me, because we spent so much time with these people, and I've never met them, but I do see them in our community. I see a lot of people in this project, and that's something that I'm really proud working for a local newspaper, that we do have that accountability. I see some of the people that we cover in the grocery store, and we're not leaving. We're there, and this is an epidemic that has touched our families. It has touched our friends. It has touched our colleagues, and so that's what was really important for us. And I know, especially when I look at Dan, we ended up doing a follow-up story, and you want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, a few weeks after this ran, I got a call from Dan's mom, and I could tell she had thought a lot about this before she called. She'd been dealing with Dan's struggle with addiction for a long time. And, she said, I understand why you guys did this story, but I really wish it hadn't been my son in the story. And, I think that for me hit me pretty hard, because, she was very understanding about why we did this. She understood why we did it. She appreciated why we did it, I think. She wasn't yelling or screaming. She wasn't, lecturing us about, our role as journalists. She was just a mom looking out for her kid. And I think, that hit home for us why we're doing this and why we had to try to do this in as ethical and respectful way as we could. We talked a lot about this at the outset, that we were going to run into people like Dan who we were going to catch on their worst days. And the reality of that process is that it's not necessarily fair, because if we picked a different week, it'd be somebody else's kid. It'd be somebody else in that picture. So we have to understand that, and we have to treat these people with the respect they deserve. And, I think at the end of the day, I'm happy to say, is gone through a rehab program. Terry did a follow-up on him a few months ago.
He's doing great.
As far as we know, he's doing great.
Yeah.
And, after talking to his mom, one of the ways we kind of resolved, I won't even say it was a disagreement. I think she just wanted to talk about the story and about her son. And she said, people don't see the boy that I raised. So I said, why don't you write a column about this? And why don't you give us a picture that's not that, and show us that kid? So she did that, and she did a terrific job, and we ran that column with a photo of him and her as a teenager. I think we ran a picture of him in his baseball uniform, because that's who these people are. They're your neighbors, and I think that helped her. I think it helped us. I think it helped the community just to kind of see that as a little coda to the story, that you could say, these are folks who are struggling, and some of them make it, like Dan, we hope, and some of them don't, like Stephanie. And we're continuing to follow up on these stories, like we did with Stephanie's children and with others, in the hope that we can kind of, not overdo it, but we want to just let people know that the struggle is continuing, and that the people we showed them and whose lives we shared with them are still out there trying to make this all work. So, and I did want to say one other thing about collaboration. We did not mention that the folks at USA Today, Sean Sullivan and his team, did a fantastic job building the platform that made this all possible. This was not an easy lift for them. When they get a call from some property out in Gannett land out there saying, we need some help building a property, they've got 9,000 things they've got to do for USA Today every day. And for them to do that, and to take the time to do that, and to do it with the sensitivity that they did it with, was really incredible and appreciated. So I think Sean might be here, but wherever he is, I owe him another beer because a couple, 3 or 4 that we drank last night probably weren't enough. But we, we really appreciated that. And I think that goes to the point of how much collaboration is required to make this work. Not just in our own newsroom, but we needed the resources of USA Today and everything they could bring to bear. And that, that's how it happened. So I think we like to leave a lot of time for questions for this because we don't know what people are thinking. So if anyone has a thought, we'd like to talk about what you want to talk about. There's a lot of ground we didn't cover, so if anybody has questions about how we did it, why we did it, problems we ran into, we're happy to talk to you about it.
I'm just curious, did you guys ever think about converting this all to black and white for effect? Was there any debate about it?
No. We don't usually convert things to black and white. It's honestly has not really been one of those things that we even really thought about.
I've been out of the loop a long time, but when I was in, they would sometimes convert to black. Even Geographic was converting some of their projects to black and white. So I'm just curious.
We did used to do that.
At all?
Yeah, I think we used to.
We haven't done that in a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it shows you how retro I am.
Have other papers reached out to you about how to do their own collaboration?
We've talked to professional groups. We've talked to some other reporters about the project. Not necessarily specifically about heroin. Terry does that a lot because she covers this thing every day. She has a network of reporters and obviously a network of people who are attached to this issue that she deals with all the time. So she's in contact with folks like that a lot about, how do we show this problem? How do we talk about the problem? We talked about that before we sent people out is, what language do we use to describe the people we're showing here? We don't use words like addict. We try to stay away from words like used or clean. These are people struggling with the disease or struggling with addiction. As we're writing it, sometimes she would drive me crazy with some of the language stuff, but it's like you try to be sensitive about this stuff. It was important, the words matter. And so we did talk a lot about how we deal with that. And I think she spends a lot of time talking to other reporters about that, about how to approach this story and about how to talk to the people who are in it and living it.
When you ask questions, get the microphone close, please.
Hi, I'm Christy. I'm with the Athens Photographic Project. I was just wondering, and by the way, thank you, because we would never have known if it had been for y'all, this was ever happening, because we hear it on the news a lot, but now it's like we're one-on-one with your photographs. I'm like, oh yeah, I have never even seen the wrappings of heroin, and I never even knew it could be that small and that dangerous. And so, I come from Meigs County. I lived through, pot and all that other stuff. So I know what that's like by reading it and seeing it. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. I know that, I wish this doesn't happen, but if you don't see it, it just goes over the head. So, and because I would never have known that, the needle of the Narcan stuff is that big. I don't like needles, but, it's just seeing that, and it's just, it's real to some people, but to others of us who don't do that kind of stuff, it's like, oh yeah, that's just amazing. It's not amazing, but to see that and actually seeing somebody save another's life, because it's just they can go from that to that, and it gives people hope that you can go from that to that and pretty much lick the problem, but it's still there. So thank you so much.
It's a very surreal thing to witness. I was in the back of an ambulance, and the guy was brought back to life there. It's like my knees are hitting his shoulders because it's really tight. And I just remember he gets up and he's like, was I just dead? And that wasn't the first time. It's not going to be the last. It's a really surreal thing to see someone blue and then talking and giving their social security number within 5 minutes. And it's something that we have seen a lot. Yeah, and I mean, that's Allie right there. She overdosed in her home and was brought back and just talking normally just minutes later.
It's one of the reasons we don't know how many overdoses for sure happened that week, is we could only document those who actually had a connection to a hospital. But we ourselves saw people get Narcan, get up, and walk away. And we know those people were not counted in the count. So we feel pretty comfortable that number was probably at least double what it was. But we only went with what we could actually document.
And it was a low week.
It was a slow week, which was also, frankly, a good thing. I mean, one of my biggest fears going into this week was that we were going to have a bad batch of fentanyl or something like that, and we would have this awful situation where you have multiple people dying or overdosing, and it would, obviously be a horrible story we'd have to cover in that moment, but also it would detract from the routine of this. I mean, part of the power, I think, of the story is the unrelentingness of this story and the epidemic that you see in these stories that in and of themselves are not particularly, in many cases, super compelling. It's a day in court, or it's just a visit to a methadone clinic. But taken together, and you see them strung together time after time after time, that's where some of the power comes from. And so we were glad for a lot of reasons it was a slow week. But the reality is this is what a slow week looks like.
And the interesting thing about the fentanyl component is that, in fact, there was a bad batch of fentanyl just coming into the system in that week or two, because I got Stephanie Gaffney's autopsy report, and it showed a fentanyl analog, and I called the coroner's office and said, what is this? And they said that it had been they'd been starting to see that particular analog come in about 6 weeks before. So here's Stephanie, who's presumably been sober for a long time, and then she uses, and it's not just heroin, it's not just fentanyl, it's this super hyper powerful form of fentanyl, and she probably used what she was using when she stopped, and it was catastrophic. She was in the hospital with no brain function for 4 days. And so it was just a catastrophe in all ways. So we were lucky that we had sort of hit a trough, but it was very shortly after that they started seeing this fentanyl take effect in the community.
Is that okay? Okay. It's kind of twofold. One is very much piggybacking off of what you guys were just talking about, how you deal with this psychologically, individually as you're working on this. And then the other one would be, I know when I was here, I was very much encouraged to take on all roles, right? Learn video, take the stills, get the writing down. And so I'm wondering for students and myself, current and getting ready to graduate, what you'd recommend for, is the future of journalism this collaboration with experts, or should we all try to be an expert or in more subjects than just one? So they're twofold.
I mean, we did it all. I mean, all the photographers were shooting photos and stills, which in a lot of ways makes, I think, the work suffer, but we just didn't have enough people to be able to do that. And some reporters were shooting photos and video. I mean, Dan had a huge component on the actual video at the end, and we had, you wrote the narration with Terry does the narration. So, we had Carrie Cochran wrote, a lot of the pieces too. So, from my standpoint, it's so important to be able to do it all, but actually leaning on those experts, like that's where, I learned a lot in this project, a lot. I had never produced or been a part of a project that was this long, like a 30-minute piece. And so we learned a lot together, and I think, yes, we were kind of doing it all, but I mean, there's a reason why Dan and Terry wrote the bulk of it. I don't know, do you have a better answer to that one?
No, I think the short answer is papers have to work together. Reporters and videographers and photographers and editors have to work together more than they used to. I mean, it seems kind of strange that our newsroom has gotten a lot smaller, but there's a whole lot more collaboration going on every day, let alone on a big project like this. And out of necessity, I think, because we don't have the big mass of people who can just go off and do their things on their own. There's a lot of stuff that's not getting covered the way it used to get covered. So if we're gonna dive in and do it, you have to go in with people who know what they're doing. You know, Ann covers health. You know, Sarah knows all about, you know, these communities out beyond Cincinnati, and Mike does data and graphics and animations, and, you know, and Meg is a photo goddess, as we all know. I mean, so it's like, you know, so we, you know, everybody's got to lean on everybody and what they're good at and what they, you know, what their knowledge base is in order to make this kind of project happen. Because you can still do big projects with one or two people, certainly. You could not have done this with one or two people, certainly. But I think you're going to see more of it, and I think out of necessity, because everybody's got to kind of, you know, be an expert or at least a dabbler in almost everything these days.
Yeah, I think especially if you're working at a smaller paper where you may or may not have a photographer, or you're relying on stringer photographers, I think it's important to have at least a baseline of knowledge with how to use a DSLR camera or a little bit about video, because you're going to be expected to do that, especially if you're working in a small paper. And there's more and more papers that aren't, you know, considered small, that, you know, are making cuts and don't have photographers. So I think it is important to have a baseline knowledge.
Sometimes you don't know what's possible until you talk to someone. Mike and I are working on a project just last week, and, you know, I said, can we do this? And he's like, we could do this. And it's like, that'll work. And then he's, you know, you have to sit down with him and figure out how this can all come together and what's realistic and doable in the time frame that you have. And to some extent, that's always been true of newspapers, but it's more true today, because you've got to do it all.
Hi, when I was reading your story, one part that really stood out to me was the lost boys. I found that just heartbreaking, especially Scotty and Lizzie.
Yep.
And I was just wondering if, since you guys have written it, if you guys have followed up with them and had contact.
Yes. You know, for those who haven't read it, this was the through line story that we were hoping to get a single story that we could follow through for the week. Just one, because we didn't want to burden people with trying to follow people in and out of all their lives. We wanted to swoop in and swoop out of these scenes and these lives, but we wanted to have one through line if we could. We weren't sure we could get one. By that Monday afternoon, when we were doing our nightly, you know, recap of where we were at and what had come in, Carol Motzinger had found, I can't remember if it was Kim or Lizzie, but she found one of the moms, and I believe it's Kim who'd lost her son. And so there were two moms. One boy had relapsed and died of an overdose. The other was his friend, and he vanished. He went missing. And so you have one mother planning her son's funeral, and you have another mother looking for her son and hoping she's not going to be doing the same thing in a few days. So that became the through line. I believe the son who survived that week did go through a rehab program. I don't know the last time we followed up with him, but there was a point where he had.
We did an interview with
We
him.
did do an interview, He was in jail, right? Yeah,
But he wanted to talk. It was his idea.
He did.
Actually, he wanted to have his voice, and yeah, he looks good too.
Yeah, and as parents will tell you, parents of addicted children will tell you that their kid getting arrested and put in jail is often a huge relief, and she was happy that he had been there. It was a source of friction, I think, between her and him, because obviously he doesn't feel that way. But yeah, we did follow up. But I thought that was an important story to tell throughout the story, to have just one thing that people could hang on to. We did have conversations as these scenes were coming together about I think Amy had talked to me at one point about, none of these scenes in and of themselves is really a story we might just write on its own. Some are, obviously. Stephanie's story was an exception, and there were some others. But, the question was, are these powerful enough? And I think the answer is, in each of them alone, probably not. But when you put them together in the way that we did visually and storytelling-wise, I think that's where that power came from, and I think that's why people responded the way they did.
So I live in Cincinnati, and I worked at Kroger, and I saw someone overdose in the parking lot, and they crashed their car. And I still think about that today a lot. It's just like a traumatic moment. And my question for you guys is like, what was the emotional toll for the journalists who are like willingly putting themselves into this situation? And was that a discussion that was had, and like were there resources offered?
Do you want to talk about it?
I think the one thing that I heard in the newsroom in the weeks and months following the publication was that there was a desire, we did not do this, but there was a desire for us to have a debrief. How's everyone checking in on people? Because this was trauma for everybody. And I think we're often in denial about the trauma that is attendant in this work. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk about that enough. I had Kara. So Kara and I could sort of walk through our trauma together on this. And part of what we do to solve our trauma is to follow up. So that's what we did with Stephanie, and we followed up. And that gave me some healing, I think, to know that Eliana was safe and was going to be a happy kid. And I think that helped. But I think one thing newsrooms need to be mindful of is that when you do tackle stories like this, small or large, you need to take care of each other and nurture each other through these painful moments, because as you're right, you never forget it.
And that's something I should have done better. I'm realizing it now after reflecting on this, because Carrie Cochran and I pretty much sat in a room and watched this footage over and over for 3 weeks straight. And we didn't sleep a lot. I saw more sunrises that month than like any other time in my life, because we were just sleeping at the newsroom putting this together because it was a quick timeline. And it was kind of like, put your head down, get the work done, and then I kind of had to like put it to the side. I couldn't look at it. I couldn't, I haven't watched the full-length piece since we produced it, because it brings back a lot of stuff. So that's something that I definitely should have done better. I know a lot of us were just kind of in the mode of work. I know when I have a camera in front of my face, there's this weird like protective shield about it. Like, I can't see blood, but if I have a camera in front of my face, I'm fine. And so that was like something we kind of hid behind, but it does catch up with you. I think this is the first time in 2 years I've been able to like reflect on the experience and think about it without getting as emotional, because we were so tied to this. Yeah. And talking about you seeing an overdose, or someone crashing their car, part of our video is someone sent us a vertical iPhone video of someone crashing on the highway into a semi, and then the passenger and the driver being pulled out of the car because they both overdosed, and someone reviving them. And it, you have to be very forgiving with those kind of videos, because those moments are so important. But that was just one of those moments that it hit someone and they sent us the video. And that's what we're seeing. That's what our community is seeing. And we all need to process it a little better.
I'm wondering about access, HIPAA laws, authorities' reluctance to have reporters nearby. What kind of challenge was that, and how did you get the access that you needed to do the incredible work that you did?
Well, we didn't get access to everything we wanted. The HIPAA laws kept us out of the hospitals. We wanted to be in ERs. We were not allowed to be in ERs. The biggest thing we leaned on was the goodwill that Terry had built up from covering this, doing good old-fashioned beat reporting for a good couple years before we did this story. She knew people. I mean, her Rolodex became kind of the backbone of the schedule that we would put together and the people we would try to go out and find. I mean, ultimately, we were as I said, we wanted to just be present where this epidemic was happening, but Terry had covered this, so she kind of helped steer us to a lot of those places. And that goodwill goes a long way. We knew some police officers, we knew firefighters. Some of us have been working in town a long time. I knew the judges. I was in the courtroom that day. They let us sit right back behind their bench, and we could just sit there and watch the stuff roll in. Other people had other sources they could lean on for this. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of beat reporting on this, and not just the heroin beat, although that was hugely important. A lot of people knew a lot of people in town and could say, hey, is it okay if we do this? Is it okay if we come by? Is it okay if we're here at this time in this place? Then there were other places where we had to talk to our lawyer about, all right, can we just sit in this parking lot and shoot this? Can we go to this park and shoot this? And the general rule, to make long story short, is that if it's a public place, if it's happening in the public domain, then we can shoot it. And we did. That does not let us off the hook from making some tough ethical decisions, and we did make some of those too, about what you use and what you don't. And but I think those conversations typically went along the lines of, we have to think about this and we have to be sensitive to this, but we also have to show this for what it is. We can't sanitize it. So that was the kind of the balance that we walked wherever we went, and in all those places that we were present, was how do we walk that line and treat these people with dignity, but also tell this story for what it is. And I don't know, that was a struggle some days, but this is what we got.
I think we got pretty good access in the prisons across Ohio too. Most prison officials in ODRC were pretty receptive to us coming in and sitting in on Narcotics Anonymous meetings or Heroin Anonymous meetings. I would have liked to have brought a camera in, but that was not allowed in my case. And courts generally set their own rules on, how much recording or you can do in the courtroom. In Marion County, under the judge that was in place at the time, I could bring a camera in and take pictures. So it just kind of depends on your local judges too, with respect to courts.
It helped too that, as Ann pointed out, a lot of people do want to talk about this.
Yeah.
The people who are living this every day know what a big problem it is, and they understand that if that problem gets attention, they might get help. And so I think that was a motivating factor for people too.
Meg, you talked about how the whole newsroom learned how to take iPhone photo and video for this project. How much of that was used in the final story?
Very little. The key to the documentary, we wanted to have scenes. We used some of a few snippets here and there, but it was mostly the work of our dedicated staff photographers that we used, because they know how to build a scene with video, and we didn't want just we didn't want it to be chopped up. We had, what I mentioned before with the little bit of iPhone footage that we got provided, it was, very little was from reporters. I think a lot of reporters focused on shooting stills. So and a lot of things we had to cut, as I said before. All the body cam footage that we got, we could use very little of it, and sometimes we had to blur faces, and so there was a lot of those restrictions. But yeah, we did try. I was instructing people to hold their shot for 20 seconds. That did not happen very often. So that was out.
Before our last two questions, I want to let everybody know we will be out of here in 5 minutes. So if you have another class, we will let you get out in time. So.
We had a group here on campus, had Amy Wilson on campus in the fall, and she talked about how she couldn't really think of a specific instance where she would have maybe taken something out and put something else in, or flip-flopped a couple things. I was wondering if you guys, looking back on it, had anything else that you wished you would have put in or taken something out. I know it's might be easy to say in hindsight, but I was just curious if you guys had any examples.
We cut so much. It's just, it was that The hardest part was just stripping it down to each scene down to those moments. And that, it sounds like that would be the easy thing, because it's like, well, you just take this thing, but you've got to go through all those notes and all that video to find those moments. So it was really kind of an addition by subtraction process. And so looking back, there's not a lot I can think of that we would put back in. You know, we were trying to serve a couple of masters. One is we wanted to tell the story accurately and in a way that people hung with it. And the other was we had to keep an eye on pacing throughout the story, because if people started drifting or losing interest, or they hit a scene that just didn't work, they were going to drop off. And so when we put things in, it was often things like a 911 call or a police report or something like that to just kind of propel us to that next scene a little bit. And if it felt like it was dragging, we'd cut the scene or cut it down. That's a creative process all its own. It was an interesting thing to do, but that was kind of our thinking as we went along, is like, how do we serve the story and tell it accurately, but also, we have the practical concerns of, we need something at 2 p.m. on Tuesday. You know, what do we got? You know, you can't have 5 great things happen at 10 a.m. and then we've got nothing from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So you have some very practical concerns you have to deal with too, and how things fit, because you can't just shuffle these scenes around. They happen when they happen. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but you know, we paid a lot of attention to that kind of thing, to what goes in and what goes out, and how that story was paced.
I really resisted the temptation to lobby Dan and Terry over Stephanie, because there were some nuances to that tipped the balance back and forth for me almost on a daily basis, because it was such a compelling moment, and yet the most compelling moment happened outside the timeline. So how do we reconcile that? And I think we did it the right way, but I did have to kind of hold myself back from lobbying for it, because the task of condensing was Dan and Terry's, and if you have people banging on the door saying, put mine in, that's not fair to that job. So I let them make their decision. They decided to keep it in. Here's the resolution. I was like, good, great.
I mean, for me, with Stephanie's story, the only danger of that story not coming in is that the family had just really objected to it. Obviously, legally, we could have used it, but I think if the parents had said absolutely not, we would not have used it.
I went to the funeral with the express intent of telling them we're going to put her story this moment in the paper. And of course they were bereaved. Are they processing this information? I gave them my card, please call me, let's talk about this, but they were all on board. Right. So.
And we had a practical problem of trying to figure out how that fits, because the narrative is the narrative, it's real time. We don't break the narrative, and that's the freaking rule. But, we had this thing happen, and we thought, do we do an epilogue and we stick it at the end? Well, nobody's going to remember what happened on Wednesday if we stick it at the end. And so we thought, all right, one time we will break this narrative, one time, and we'll put it right there. And we left the scene basically as I'd written it 3 days before she died. We left that scene as it is, and then we just dropped that line in at the end. So I don't think that would have worked if we went in and out of the narrative for everything, but I think in that case it was justified.
I think that added some rocket fuel to the narrative and pushed people through the rest of the story.
We have time for one last question, and I think a fairly brief response. So, Jonathan?
Hello. First, I'm from Cincinnati, and a lot of people were touched by this story, so thank you for that. Local news does matter. But through this whole process of doing this story, was there anything you learned about yourself that you're like, okay, I can do that?
I learned a lot about what we're capable as a newsroom. This was not something that I ever dreamed of when I came back to work at the paper. This was an extraordinary week where I know we were stretched. I was so impressed by how everyone came together. I think it's made us a stronger newsroom as we pursue our individual beats and individual stories. We kind of, there's still that collaboration, that sense of collaboration. Even when I'm doing a project, I know I can go to Dan and have him look at it. I can go to someone and that was something that it existed before, but now I feel like it's more of a team effort. So, I mean, yes, I learned stuff about myself individually. I learned stuff about myself. I know we all did, but I think the biggest lesson for us was how much we can accomplish as a team and how much we can serve our community. And what that meant to our community was just, it was incredibly valuable to us.
And the staff did embrace it. I know I said that at the beginning, but I was in awe of everyone stepping up the way they did, because we've all been a part of projects that people drag you into and well, we got to do this thing, but nobody had that attitude about this. Everybody, I think, sensed that it really mattered and it was important, and they all stepped up. I didn't hear a lot of complaining that week. I didn't hear people saying this will never work or anything like that. I mean, everybody really dove in and stepped out of their comfort zones and just did really, really good work.
I would just echo Meg and Dan. I'm just really glad that Cincinnati looped in the other sister papers in this, because we wouldn't have been able to do this without them. And they, made a separate story just for the sister papers, just combining all of the different stories from Newark and Marion and Chillicothe and all the other sister papers in Cincinnati as well. And yeah, that would not have been possible without Dan and the rest of the team in Cincinnati, that handful of people.
We are at the end of our time. You've been an amazing audience. Thank you all for coming, and thank you guys.